Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question which I will flip in here, and he wants to know what are my thoughts on super slow training or slow cadence training? What's the deal with this? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, do a little bit of crafting, and let's talk about this. Alright guys, this whole super slow training thing, in certain circles, it comes in and out of vogue, and meaning those circles is generally more people who are bodybuilding oriented, physique oriented, things like that. Not really going to be popular, obviously, in athletic and sports circles, or people who want maximum power and speed, because again, specificity of training. You don't get fast by training slow. I mean, let's be honest, at least when it comes to muscle fiber recruitment. There are sports endeavors that require focus where you could do that, but that's nothing to do with training your actual muscles. So the whole idea here is that the concept behind it, of why it comes into vogue and why it sounds good in theory, is it's harder to lift a weight really, really slow. All right, every rep seems like it's heavier, takes a lot of work. It really seems to strain things. It feels like you're doing more work, and bodybuilders oftentimes take that mentality of, if you can make an exercise feel harder, you are probably working harder. You're probably recruiting more muscle fibers. And you know what? In some cases, that's actually true. In some cases, that's actually true. There are times when performing an exercise in a way that's more difficult recruits more fibers, and sometimes in a way that makes it easier just lets you add weight on the bar while basically doing the same amount of work. Meaning, usually when you start adjusting range of motion, for example, that's a perfect example. When you make a range of motion shorter on an exercise, it usually gets easier. When you make a range of motion longer, it becomes harder. And so again, deadlifting up in a rack versus deadlifting off the floor versus deadlifting off of a deficit, to where you're standing on plates or a platform and having to pull the weight further. Obviously, the shorter the distance you move the weight, the easier it is, right? Because it's doing less work. And you guys got to remember, the start of a deadlift is the hardest part. So if you can skip that part, it becomes easier. If you can make that part longer, it becomes harder. So if you pull from a deficit, it becomes harder. So there is some truth to that idea. Same thing when it comes to an exercise being harder, because you really, really focus on good technique. Tight form can make a lift harder. Therefore, it recruits more of the muscle fibers of what you're looking to recruit out of the muscles you're looking to recruit. And if you use sloppy form, you can throw more weight around and it's easier. All right, so there is truth to that idea. So, I mean, bodybuilders don't actually have it wrong with that concept, because in a lot of cases, they're very, very right. And those examples I gave you are perfect examples. However, when it comes to this super slow training, it's not always the case. You are moving a weight more slowly. You're actually doing a lower workload density. So it might seem harder because, lifting a weight slowly, then lowering it slowly, and it makes you sore and tired and everything. But like, well, you're working harder, so therefore it must be recruiting more muscle fibers. But in this case, it just seems like you're working harder. You aren't actually working harder. And that's what people need to understand. And when you talk about basic things like force generation, there's been plenty of data looked at over decades about muscle fiber recruitment. And you know what we find? Usually the faster that you have to accelerate a weight using good technique, the more muscle fibers get recruited. It is actually harder, and it takes more work to move a weight faster. And that should make some sense. Now, the Menzers and all these people, Mike Menzer used to talk about this, of no, you're just creating inertia, and therefore that inertia is moving the weight, and so therefore you need to slow it down. It's not recruiting muscle fibers. But the reason he's wrong is that it required extra muscle fibers to start the weight. Meaning, usually the most muscle fiber recruitment is usually involved with starting a weight, moving from the bottom of an exercise. That's usually the hardest part. So if that is where you're generating the most force, you actually are recruiting more muscle fibers. And you're just continuing to recruit them to keeping it accelerated. But the overall rep itself, even though you might be recruiting fewer near the top of the lift because you have inertia going, you recruited a lot more at the bottom. And so therefore, when you accelerate a weight faster using the same form or using a good technique, it recruits more muscle fibers through the sum of the lift than if you do it slower. And what I mean is that when you balance the total muscle fiber recruitment out done for the entire rep, The one in which you accelerated it more at the start actually ends up recruiting more muscle fibers. And that's kind of the idea there. That's what's going on. And so when you look at it from that perspective, people need to understand it actually is harder and it takes more work to accelerate a weight more quickly, particularly from a dead stop or from the bottom of an exercise. So training faster usually recruits more muscle fibers. All right, but the caveat there being if you're using good form. Now, if you're using really shitty, sloppy form to just fling a weight up quickly, all right, using bad form to just fling a weight up quickly, such as just cheating on a barbell curl, okay, that's not the same. You may not be recruiting as many muscle fibers as if you had done it more slowly, but that's because you're swinging your body and adding hip drive and everything else. As Ripto would say, hip drive. You're adding hip drive to a curl. Well, obviously that's not recruiting more muscle fibers in your bicep to be using your hips to get the weight started faster. So yeah, in that case, if you slowed it down, it would recruit more muscle fibers. But if you use really good form to accelerate it more quickly, all right, and you locked in your technique to where the bicep is starting it, well, the opposite would be true. So there is a form component to talk about when you do that. So when we talk about speed, that's assuming no changes in technique or form to accelerate it faster. Now, if you're throwing other muscles in to accelerate it faster, all right, the slower method might have a point. But again, it's about technique. Now, the other thing that you've got to look at is the eccentric end of it, because that's just talking about getting the weight moving. The concentric, the lifting of the weight. The lowering is a little bit more of a debate, because lifting a weight more slowly recruits less muscle fibers, flat out. That's just basic human physiology. The lowering is where we get into a debate. So some people will argue that if you lift the weight quickly but lower it slowly, you're getting better results, because the eccentric component of a lift, the lowering of the weight, has been shown to be a significant tool in growing muscles. Now, people need to remember, eccentric reps are not necessary to grow muscles. You can do exercises where you drop the weight on every single rep. All right, you could deadlift, push press, do pin lay rows, power cleans, everything else without an eccentric rep, to where you actually let it drop each time. And you could still gain muscle quite fine as long as the workload is high enough. All right, and that's what people have to consider there. Tension and workload absolutely do matter. The eccentric reps add to the workload. If you're doing an eccentric rep on every rep and not just the concentric, then you are doing more workload. You're subjecting the muscle to more work. So it plays a role. But as far as slower eccentrics, meaning more than about a second long, adding to your muscle gains, that's been debated heavily. There have been studies done over the years. Sometimes you have studies that come up and show that it gives no advantage. Sometimes you have studies that come up and show that lowering it slowly gives a little bit of an advantage. You know what? I think that there have been so many studies back and forth and in various meta-analysis on it that I'm not even sure what the current consensus is anymore. But I've seen studies that show that it does. I've seen studies that show that it doesn't. But what we do know is that irrespective of if that's true or not, lowering the weight slowly is, if it does add growth, it is just adding workload. You could get the same thing by doing an extra rep. All right, you could just do one more rep instead of lowering it a lot slower and probably get all the benefits of that. The downside to lowering it really slow is that it will make you more sore. So that's what people need to weigh out with that. Is there a possible advantage to lowering it slowly? Yeah, there might be. There might be. Is it free? No, because it does cause a little more soreness. So you've got to weigh that out for yourself, if the perceived benefit worth the extra soreness that it might cause. And you know what? It's not guaranteed to cause soreness. People who are highly trained, who aren't making major changes to their programs, actually oftentimes don't get sore at all from training. So, it may not even be a factor for you. So if that's the case for you and you feel like you get more muscle gains from it, you're confident in that in your training, and you just feel like over time going a little slower on the eccentrics gives you more gains, then okay, do so, particularly if it's not making you sore, or at least uncomfortably sore, then by all means do so, because at the end of the day, whether something is proven conclusively to work or not, if it isn't harming you, and you feel that it adds something of benefit to your training, then do what you're confident with, because at the end of the day, you have to personally be confident in your training style and feel like you're getting what you want out of it to keep you motivated and interested, because you know what does affect your gains the most? how consistent you're going to be. And someone who feels that a training style they're doing yields good benefits is going to have a more positive attitude about it. Whether it's proven or not is besides the point. If you feel that you're getting more gains from it, then you're more confident in it. You're going to be more confident in it. You're more likely to be consistent with it. And if you're more consistent, you're going to get better gains. So if you feel that slower negatives are giving you something of value to your training and you enjoy doing it that way, then by all means continue to do so. I think that it remains unproven, but just because it's unproven or the data is mixed on it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It might mean that it works for some people better than others. You might be one of those people that it works better for. So don't let me stop you from doing it just because I say it's unproven to work, because it very well might be helping you. And at the very least, if you think it's helping you and it's not costing you anything, then what's the problem? I see no issue with that. Do your thing. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.